communicating about unconventional monetary policy became the new normal for the Fed since the GFC. And this is well explained in the book of Byoung-Ki, New Tools of Monetary Policy. Also, the intensity for such terms during the COVID-19 is higher than during previous crises. And this is highlighted by this figure. Now, let's talk about the COVID-19. Fed's communication waves about the COVID-19 anticipated waves of new cases. Chairman speeches communicated earlier about the COVID-19 compared to the first new cases. And then we think that the Fed well understood this crisis and anticipated its communication before it came to the US. The volatility dramatically increased with the COVID-19 outbreak in China and several countries, including the US. COVID-19 mentions in the Fed's communication corresponded to unconventional monetary policy considerations and preceded the first wave of new cases in the US. And we see that the communication of unconventional monetary policy was correlated with increase of new cases, but also correlated with the start of the decrease in volatility. And there is a lot of other correlation. These indicators are quite linked together. There is also an uncertainty effect. What we call an uncertainty effect is that uncertainty consideration, textual uncertainty, are related to unconventional monetary policy mentions and so actions. COVID-19, unconventional monetary policy, and uncertainty, textual uncertainty, are highly correlated in Fed communications. We have also these financial stability sentiments that show us that, except at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, financial stability sentiment seems coordinated with the virus spreading. So this piece of results are summarized here. Following the GFC, central bank communication anticipated effective unconventional monetary policy implementations, meaning actions. The timing and intensity of the unconventional monetary policy were dramatically different between crises. Fed communication about the COVID-19 anticipated waves of new cases. The unconventional monetary policy communication aimed at reducing market volatility together with COVID-19 spillovers. And also uncertainty in central bank communication well anticipated COVID-19 waves. Also Fed's financial stability sentiment generally anticipated well COVID-19 waves. Now let's talk about other piece of results I would like to show you. The mention of uncertainty related words, textual uncertainty, were lower during the COVID-19 than in previous years or crises. And this is quite evident here, that unconventional monetary policy terms, but also uncertainty in green that you see, was lower during the COVID compared to the dot-com and the GFC. This is for the announcement. We have another pattern for the minutes, and we see that before the crisis, uncertainty was high. Before the COVID-19 crisis, uncertainty was, textual uncertainty was higher, and a voluntary maybe decrease in the use of contextual uncertainty was implemented during the COVID, and we see this sharp decrease in order to come back to the same levels than the GFC. We see also that the decrease of conventional monetary policy of the interest rate is correlated also to a previous decrease in financial stability sentiment. This is for the minute. We see the same pattern for the announcement. We see this pattern less for the speeches, but also the speeches are speaking about a lot of subjects, not only focused on monetary policy considerations. So the picture is less obvious. And so I have additional results that I will just go over quickly. The increase in the exchange rate seems related to decreasing mentions of uncertainty related words in Fed's communication. Unconventional monetary policy and so actions are related to some exchange rate dynamics. We have also a relation between unemployment and sentiments. So we compute an average of all the sentiment indicators we presented. So we put an average of all the sentiment indicators I presented before, and we see that the negative sentiment correspond to unemployment turning points, except during the COVID-19. And this may confirm our intuition about the optimism conveyed voluntarily or not by the Fed communications during the COVID-19 crisis. So unlike Srefi, we show that the financial stability sentiment of both interest rate announcement and minutes relate to interest rate decisions rather than speeches. Positive aggregated sentiment in all Fed communications relates to decreasing unemployment, and except around significant unconventional monetary policy steps, the exchange rate relates to Fed's communications uncertainty. So what are the policy implications of all of this work? So the Fed may have conducted a specific communication policy for the COVID-19, and we see this with a lot of our measures. This potential policy conveyed less uncertainty, so more optimism, to the public while conveying topics related to the situation. And we think, and we can interpret this behavior of the Fed communication, a kind of optimism without affecting transparency. Also, timely communication, together with the actions, stabilize financial markets more and maybe for the long run. So these are our conclusions. Both the content and timing of the Fed's communication changed between crises. Fed's communication sentiments significantly changed during the COVID-19 compared to the GFC. Communicating about unconventional monetary policy became a new normal in Fed's minutes and chairman speeches since the GFC. COVID-19 caused structural changes in the Fed communication content, but also in comparison with other crises. And conventional monetary policy relates to financial stability sentiment. Thank you very much. Communication is also a social network, so please connect and feel free to ask your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. First, I'd like to check if there is any comments or questions from the speakers.
If you don't mind, I would like to ask.
Oh, okay, cool.
Make a comment. I'm trying to put my video on, but it doesn't. I hope I'll get it on by the time I'm supposed to speak. Oh, here we go. Yeah, Jonathan, I think this was really interesting. This is very rich material. So, you know, I still need to digest a lot of what you said. But the one thought I had when you presented this is every crisis is different, right? So you're comparing the dot-com and the global financial crisis and now the pandemic. Now, you know, they were very different in nature, and that might have come along with a very different type of uncertainty that the Fed was confronted with. And this is interesting, but maybe that's not the only thing you would want to get at with this research. So I was wondering, you know, could you also extract measures of uncertainty, I don't know, by newspapers or by fiscal policy makers or by financial markets to find out what is the uncertainty or the sentiment that really relates to the monetary policy part of all of this, right? Because, you know, there could be a lot of uncertainty about the role of fiscal policy, because the role of fiscal policy was very different in this crisis than in the previous ones. And so maybe, you know, extracting that, you know, I think would be really interesting to help us better understand, you know, was it indeed easier for the central bank to start thinking about unconventional monetary policies? You seem to suggest this because they started talking earlier about this. But the sort of extracting really the monetary policy component of that, I think could be really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Michael. So yes, this is a very good question. Very good question. So yes, indeed, there is a lot of work that are dealing with the media, and also, but we do think that the media have two main problems. The first one is that they are very, very noisy. They are very dependent also of the source that you are using, but also they are expressing a sentiment. Each journalist can express its own sentiment, and each journal has its own policy. What we wanted to focus on is more the Fed sentiment. I agree that the media sentiment impacted the Fed sentiment. But here that we wanted to see is that what is the Fed sentiment and how and when the Fed started to communicate and through which channel. I agree that the media sentiment have an impact on that. But what we also agree is that the timing, and as I see in this slide, was sharply different, and also the intensity, both in terms of actions and in terms of communication, were sharply different between the dot-com crisis, the GFC, that are, of course, different crises, and I agree with you that they are different crises. This may explain this delay. The differences in this crisis may explain this delay, but in any case, it is always very interesting to see that the timing of both the sentiment, both the communication and the actions were very different, and this crisis shown us that the Fed deeply considered the communication, but I mean earlier and more seriously that, or differently, of course, because they were different, this crisis, but differently than the other crises. A lot of people at the beginning of the crisis of the COVID-19 said, oh, look, it's another crisis, a financial crisis, we have no liquidity, blah, blah. But we do think that it is different also from the side of the Fed, and not only from the size or the type of the crisis. It is also, there is a very different communication policies that was established. At least we show this. We don't know what happened I'm from the Bank of Israel at the end. But we see that there is a very strong different communication policy from the Fed related to this crisis, which is like another crisis. It is a crisis, but of course they are different. Of course, the Fed behaved differently for the dot-com and for the GFC. So this is also what we try to highlight here. But yes, I agree, these are different crises, and but I'm less agree with the fact that we have to consider the media, because the sentiment of the media and the sentiment of the Fed, even if we may compare it and it could provide additional results, we wanted to focus on the Fed because it was one of the major players of the crisis. Thank you very much for your question.
I don't see any questions through the Q&A window, so I'd like to raise a question about the methodology. I think that you need a large set of data to kind of neural network learning before you apply the optimized network to topic modeling. So it seems that the learning and the application to the topic modeling happens at the same time in this paper to me. So correct me if I'm wrong. So do you need some kind of pre-learned, do you have some kind of pre-learned the network, or?
So the only thing that we fix for, so the only input information that we have for this latent Dirichlet allocation, for this topic analysis, is the number of topics. For instance, in the Bank of Israel, we see that there is more than 6 topics. There is 7 topics, because at the beginning of the sample in Israel, we had these political issues, Intifada and all of this stuff. And then we fairly assume that there is 7 topics in the communication of the Bank of Israel. But however, for the communication of the Fed, we can model the topics with only 6 topics. And what happens is, what is doing, I'm just deepening your question. Tell me if I'm wrong, but I think it's necessary to understand what the algorithm is doing is that it computes a kind of a correlation, linkage between the sentence, whatever, between the words, and then provide us 7 topics without naming them. I named. How I named these topics related to the words that are used with the higher probability. For instance, the financial stability topics, the first words were bank, stability, markets, and this is clearly financial stability topics. And this is how we named these topics. It's not, so I did not provide anything else except the text and the number of topics to this algorithm. That's why it is unsupervised. That's why we don't need dictionaries and to supervise our learning.
Okay. Thank you for your answer, and thank you for the excellent. Okay. Yeah, thank you for the excellent presentation.
Thank you very much for the question.
I guess we have to move on to the next paper. So, Michael, are you ready to take the floor?
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Michael, please go on.
Okay. I hope you're able to see my slides now. So thanks a lot, Byoung. It's great to be part of that session. Very exciting session, great papers. The paper I want to present here is joined with Alena Wabitsch. I'm at the ECB, so I have the usual disclaimer down here. These are all my own personal views. We are looking at central bank communication with non-experts, and we put a provocative sort of question in the title, is this a road to nowhere? So let me try to motivate this. So there's a lot more interest in central banks to talk with non-expert audiences. The ECB is only one example with President Lagarde arriving. I mean, she put big emphasis on communicating with non-expert audiences. I think following the global financial crisis, the use of unconventional monetary policy, there was clearly a need to actually embark more on communication with non-expert audiences. But several people have been very skeptical. And, as always, Alan Blinder puts these things very nicely. So let me put this quote here by him. He said, central banks will keep trying to communicate with the general public as they should, but for the most part, they will fail. So very gloomy assessment. And I think this comes because of various challenges that central banks are facing when they need to communicate with non-experts. They are very much used to communicating with experts. That's what they've been doing all their, on these past decades. And we know that experts are very much in reach. I mean, they really listen to every word. Maybe they are at times even over-responsive to central bank communication. Non-experts might not be in reach at all. So then how do you communicate with these people if they don't get your signal? That's the first challenge to overcome. By definition, experts know a lot about central banks and monetary policy and inflation, etc. Non-experts know less about this. So you need to actually have a very different type of communication with non-experts. Again, a challenge. And then, we're very much used to looking at financial market reactions to central bank communication. There's a huge literature. Central banks actually do this in real time. And that is nice. It allows us to understand how do these experts actually respond to communication. For non-experts, this is much harder to observe. It's not as fast, probably, and it's not as visible. And Andy Haldane and Michael McMahon, co-authors, have put this very nicely in a paper. They basically say, there's 3 important steps to making this a success. That is explanation, engagement, and education. And I would actually add to this, this is not only explaining, engaging, and educating the public. It's also, we need to explain, engage, and educate the policymakers how to communicate with non-experts. So there is a lot of evidence now recently, a lot of research coming up on how does central bank communication affect non-experts. Most of this uses randomized controlled trials, focus groups, surveys, lab experiments, and they come to very clear and robust conclusions. For example, simple and relatable messages are important. And these methods have one big upside. They run controlled experiments, so you can have a causal interpretation. So this is very nicely identified. But they also come with one big downside, and this is, you pay survey experiments, lab experiments or survey participants to actually participate in your experiments. So you engineer that they are in reach. And I just mentioned before, we don't really know whether non-experts ever get the signal by the central bank. So you're engineering the first step of central bank communication, reaching out to the public. And so these methods have a hard time actually sort of checking for that. So there's a few papers in the literature which deal with this issue. And basically the idea here is you just run surveys among the general public before and after important communications, like, for example, the FOMC press conferences. And so far, my take on that literature would be it's rather inconclusive to what extent central bank communication actually gets through to the public. So with this paper, we think we're proposing an alternative way of studying that question. And we're looking at Twitter traffic about the ECB. We think this has a couple of advantages, but of course, as always, there's also downsides. So let me start with the upsides. We're not engineering anything here. This is real life data. This is tweets that people have written about the ECB. Basically, we're not subject to this problem of the randomized controlled trials. We have this data at high frequency, which helps us using the typical identification assumptions in the event study literature. The data is also continuous. So compared to the previous papers I just mentioned, which run surveys before and after communication events, we have this data all the time. So we can look at all sorts of central bank communications. And the other thing is, we can actually ask, or we have information about many more individuals than you can possibly invite to a lab or invite to participate in a survey. And we also have tweets from experts as well as tweets from non-experts. Now, there's also issues to keep in mind. I mean, the first one is Twitter users are not representative of the general public. So that's why we keep talking about non-experts in our paper, hopefully very carefully. So this is not a paper about communication with the general public. This is really about some subset of the general public, but we try to identify non-experts. And again, this is probably also sort of the second caveat with this paper. While there's the advantage that we're observing experts and non-experts, we actually need to split the two. So we need to differentiate experts from non-experts. And I'll tell you how we do this, and then it's up to you to judge whether you think we did a good job or not in doing this. So let me explain what we do in the paper. Obviously, this is about tweets, so we need to collect tweets. There's a possibility to do so via Twitter's advanced search. We collect tweets posted between 2012 and 2018, both in English and in German, that contain at least one of these three keywords. So ECB, European Central Bank, or Draghi, who was still, in 2018 was still in office. So we're not covering the Lagarde presidency. And then we have a very elaborate cleaning procedure. For the sake of time, I don't want to talk about this. We can, if you're more interested, you can talk about this afterwards. There's a lot of tweets that are actually not related to the European Central Bank. Like, for example, there's the English Cricket Board, which also abbreviates ECB. And so, of course, we want to drop all the tweets that relate to cricket instead of monetary policy. So then after this cleaning procedure, we're left with somewhat more than 3.5 million tweets, 2 million retweets in our English sample. The German sample is much smaller. So we have 100,000 tweets and around 50,000 retweets in the German sample. To give you a flavor of what these data look like, this is just a time series plot of the number of tweets in English in the blue line and the left scale, and tweets in German on the right scale in yellow. And there's a couple of red lines here that identify ECB communication events. So the 4 lines to the right, these are just standard monetary policy announcements. Well, I mean, they are important monetary policy announcements, but this is sort of, the ECB press conference days. And you can see that typically what happens is sort of on the day of the press conference, you get sort of a lot of Twitter volume, but then the day after it goes down quite substantially. Now, if you look at the very first event here, this is July 2012, you see this is very different. So there's an ECB communication event, and then Twitter volume actually starts increasing after that for a couple of days. You might have guessed this already. This is the whatever it takes statement by President Draghi, which I'm sure you are all aware of. So this is something that triggered a big discussion on Twitter. So we'll look at this actually separately afterwards. So once we have the tweets, we look at the content of the tweets. So we follow a dictionary approach. We construct 3 measures. The first one is we look at favorableness. So this is a measure that goes from -1 to +1. And higher values basically imply more positive sentiment. So a word like awful would be -1. A word like marvelous would be +1. Then we can take this favorableness measure and just take absolute values of that. So then obviously the measure goes from 0 to 1. And higher values here reflect stronger sentiment. So awful, marvelous, dreadful, exceptional would all be now reflecting very strong sentiment. So this is really, there we can sort of test, how strong are the views that people express. And then the third measure that we extract here is a measure of subjectivity that goes from 0 to 1. And here higher value indicates more subjective statements. So things like nasty or terrible would be very high values because they are very subjective, versus actual or contemporary would give us a value of 0. And then the last thing that we collect here is information about the Twitter accounts. So we know when they were created, how many followers they have, the number of tweets that was issued from the account. Overall, we have nearly 300,000 accounts for the English sample and 16,000 accounts for the German sample. Now, if you look at the data, I think one interesting pattern that comes out very, very strong is there is a very small share of accounts that actually make up the bulk of Twitter traffic. So I tried to illustrate this here in the chart, which is a Lorenz curve. So the blue line here would be sort of a situation of pure or absolute equality, where every Twitter account contributes with the exact same amount to the overall Twitter traffic. So that's the 45-degree line. The yellow line shows you the Lorenz curve for the ECB tweets. And so here you can basically see that 95% of the Twitter accounts only contribute to 25% of the Twitter volume. And the curve gets even much steeper if you look at retweets or at likes. Here, 95% of the accounts only account for something like 5% of retweets and likes. So it's a very concentrated platform with a few accounts really making up the bulk of the traffic. Now, I mentioned to you we're trying to differentiate experts from non-experts, so I need to explain to you how we do this. In the end, we came down to something which we think is very simple. Maybe it's overly simplistic. Happy to get any views on this. We just sort of argue that experts need to be regulars, at least for the ECB's press conference. So the ECB press conference is the main ECB communication vehicle. Actually, there's one going on right now as we speak. The ECB explains the outcome of its strategy review to the public. So this is the main communication vehicle of the ECB. And if you're an expert about ECB, then we would expect that at least you're issuing a tweet for every second press conference. So there might be some press conferences which are not where people think there's not a lot of information. So you're not issuing a tweet, or you might be on holidays sometime. But at least every second press conference, we expect you to issue a tweet. So the non-experts obviously are not regulars, but we also impose another condition, and that is they tweet about many other things. So, if they were only to tweet about the ECB, then they don't look like a non-expert. So we also impose that they have low ECB centricity, meaning they are below the 25th percentile in our measure of centricity. And again, you see the very unequal distribution here. So the experts issue 25% of the tweets about the ECB, but they only account for 0.5% of the accounts. The non-experts are 25% of our accounts, but they only issue 4% of the tweets. And then, as you might have noticed, there's a lot of accounts that we actually don't characterize, and they are sort of in between because we want a clean differentiation. To sort of give you a little bit of an overview, these types of accounts are different in various respects. So, for example, non-experts are more subjective in how they talk about the ECB. They are slightly more positive, but they express so on average they are slightly more positive, but they express their views in much stronger language. So the average absolute favorableness here is a lot higher for the non-experts than for the experts. And just sort of as a check whether this is making sense, we also find that experts are much more likely to issue tweets during weekends, whereas the experts seem to have strict working hours Monday to Friday. Non-experts are more likely to issue tweets on Saturday and Sunday. So we think that's actually sort of a nice sort of validity check that we have identified non-experts. So then let's look at the first set of results here. We start off by looking at determinants of retweets and likes. So which tweets about the ECB actually get retweeted and liked. So remember, we have something like 3.6 million tweets in English. Less than 500,000 of those got retweeted or liked. And retweets and likes are different things. So roughly half of the retweeted tweets are actually liked, and roughly half of the liked tweets are actually retweeted. So they are slightly different concepts. And what we're interested in here is related to earlier literature, which has argued, about media reporting, that media are more likely to report negative stories, news that are expressed in strong views or very subjective. And so we apply this now to tweets. Given that we have 3.6 million data points, we would get very tiny standard error. So we decided to just estimate on a random sample. We randomly pick 1% of the sample. And we run a couple of regressions here. So the first column that you see looks at the likelihood to be retweeted. So this is the results of a probit model. So these are marginal effects. So you see that if a tweet is expressing a negative sentiment about the ECB, it's more likely to be retweeted. But the number is actually, so the economic significance is small. Tweets that are expressed in strong language, so absolute favorableness, again, also have a higher likelihood to be retweeted and also a higher likelihood to be liked. And the same for tweets that express their views in a very subjective language. And here these coefficients are substantially larger. So these effects then are actually quite substantial. So a tweet is more likely to be retweeted or liked if it expresses strong and more subjective views. And I think that's important for central banks to keep in mind. And then sort of the core of what we do in the paper is we look at Twitter behavior around ECB communications. So here we aggregate the data to daily level. So we have 2,500 observations. We look at the number of tweets. We also look at the concentration measure, so the Herfindahl-Hirschman indicator. We look at subjectivity, favorableness, and absolute favorableness, where we always estimate the daily average and standard deviation across tweets. So we want to sort of get a view of how heterogeneous the views are on Twitter. And we do this separately for all the accounts, then for the experts and for the non-experts. The regression setup is very simple. It's OLS. We control for day of the week effects, month of the year, holiday effects, time trend, quadratic time trend, and ECB communication events. So these beta coefficients are actually what we're interested in here. We allow for leads and lags in principle. Turns out we don't need leads and lags for nearly all communication events. That's what I tried to show you on the chart already. Typically, effects are only present on the same day. With two exceptions, the ECB press conference leads to more traffic already 5 days before and up to 4 lags 4 days afterwards. And of course, the whatever it takes speech by President Draghi, where we need 15 lags in our model. So let's look at a couple of results here. So this looks at the overall traffic log number of tweets from all accounts. You see there is a simultaneous reaction to all the events that we have in our sample here. Again, we think this makes sense. So press conference is much larger than all the others. Whatever it takes also has really big effects. For example, speeches by the president are more important than speeches by other executive board members. So we think overall this makes sense. And of course, the press conference and whatever it takes have very large effects, given that they are actually present for, they have persistent effects on Twitter traffic. So the overall response here is really sizable. Now, if we differentiate non-experts from experts, you see for the non-experts, the coefficients are typically smaller, and there's also less significance. So meaning non-experts are generally somewhat less responsive. However, they are responsive to ECB communication. And the big exception here is really the whatever it takes, where the responsiveness coefficients of non-experts and experts is really very similar. If we look at concentration measures, again, you see that concentration sort of is reduced, meaning more Twitter users actually start tweeting about the ECB on days of ECB communication. And again, in particular, whatever it takes had a big effect on the concentration. So there's a lot more tables in the paper. I want to spare you those. So let me just sort of report on the results about the content of the tone of the tweets. So we find that tweets become more factual after ECB communication, in particular for non-experts. So they have a narrower distribution of subjectivity and a lower mean. Favorableness doesn't change sort of the mean of it. So it's not that they would all be more positive or negative on average, but the spectrum of views narrows. So the standard deviation becomes smaller. And the absolute favorableness also is affected. So we actually find that the views are not expressed in such a strong language on ECB communication days. Now, all of what I've been showing related to the English language tweets. So what's the difference with the German tweets? You might expect they are more controversial or maybe more subjective, because in Germany, there's a very controversial public debate about the ECB's monetary policy. We generally find that most of the results qualitatively go through. We find quite some differences for the whatever it takes statement here. So there's the non-experts were much more responsive in Germany than in the English sample. They are also more negative about whatever it takes. And you see that this is a very controversial discussion. So the spectrum of views opens up really considerably here. And let me summarize. So basically the key findings, I think, are that non-experts basically talk about the ECB. They express stronger and more subjective opinions, and they have a larger variety of views. I've shown you the retweet and like analysis. So a tweet is more likely to be retweeted and liked if it expresses a stronger language and more subjective views. And Twitter traffic does respond to ECB communication. And we're sort of arguing there's two types of roles that Twitter is playing here. On the one hand, there's information transmission. So for most of these communication events, we just have one-day effects, stronger response by experts, typically a conversion of views, reduced subjectivity. So it seems that the ECB basically conveys information that gets talked about on Twitter. But then there's also other events where Twitter plays the role of a platform for very controversial discussions. So these last several days have very substantial involvement of non-experts, and you get a very divergent set of views that get expressed on Twitter. So what are the policy implications? It seems that central bank communication manages to reach out to non-experts. Again, central banks actually can make discussions in social media more factual and moderate. I think that's important, given that strong and subjective views are likely to be reposted more often. And we think it's important for central banks to reach out to non-expert audiences, in particular if there's instances of substantial and persistent controversial debates, such as whatever it takes. Thank you.
Thank you, Waki. Is there any questions from the speakers? I don't see any questions from the Q&A window. So
Byoung, I have a quick question for Michael.
Okay, go on.
Cool. Hey, Michael, this is a very interesting paper. I'm amazed how every time we present at the same conference, you have a new paper, and I present the same paper. But anyway, I had a small comment. I was expecting to see some sort of trend in Twitter usage in the number of users and followers and things like that. But I was surprised to see your figures that they are quite, on average, pretty standard. So did I miss something in terms of denominator or ratio or something, or there's not such thing as a trend?
So that's the reason why we started the data in 2012. So there was a very strong upward trend in 2012 until 2012, and then it stabilizes. And actually, if anything, there's a downward trend in the time series plot that I've been showing you. But so we cross-check this with, for example, Google searches or newspaper articles about the ECB, and you see the same downward trend there. So in that sense, we're happy that hopefully we're not picking up any trends that are just Twitter specific, but really relate to the interest in the ECB over time. But if you did this before 2012, you would see a very strong upward trend indeed.
Nice, thank you.
Any further questions?
Yes, I had one question.
Okay, cool.
Sorry. Yes, I had a question. It's very fantastic paper and presentation. I just wondering, so maybe I can ask the same question you asked me also with the media, but more. So I'm just wondering, do you have some characteristics? I will not ask your question. Do you have some characteristics about these experts? Because I'm working also on the characteristics, meaning the age, when they opened their account, education, some of this stuff that can shape their opinion. And if yes, does it change or shape your results?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and I'm very sad what I have to answer here. We are really constrained by what we can do here for data protection reasons, right? So this is personal data. So we're, for example, not allowed to download all the tweets by the same accounts that are not about the ECB. So I can't even tell you what they are tweeting about if they are not tweeting about the ECB. The only thing I know is how many tweets they are issuing in general, when the account was created. So that's the information I have. I have no information about them as a person, like education or age or anything else. So I'm really very much constrained in what I can do there.
Thank you very much. So what we have done, if I have 10 seconds, is that we also linked the name with some information we have with LinkedIn or anything we can find on the web, just to have a sample of 100, 200, 300 people, 300 experts, and then trying to deepen this because we show that it shapes the results, the behaviors. And I do think it would be very interesting to link your database and your results from the tweets themselves with the type of experts and the characteristics of these experts, and how these characteristics of these experts can change how they tweet, when they tweet, and all this stuff. But I do think that you have the date of Twitter opening account. No?
Yes, that I have. Yeah.
And did you use to see if it changed the results?
Yeah, that didn't make a difference. So
okay.
Yeah, we the little things that we have, we all tried them, and that didn't help.
I see. Thank you very much.
Okay, I have a quick question. So I guess there is some kind of strong interactions among the media, like Twitter, Facebook, and even the newspaper. So can you talk about a little bit of these kind of interactions among the media? You just focused on the Twitter.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a little bit similar question that I asked Jonathan before, right? Can you control for sentiment somewhere else so you actually get sort of a Twitter specific sentiment? And that's something we're thinking about. So I mean, we have access obviously to newspaper articles about the ECB, and you can generate a sentiment measure for those and then see how this compares. Now, the one thing I mentioned already, what we have done is just sort of by visual comparisons of the number of media reports about the ECB and the Twitter traffic. I mean, that correlates very highly, but we haven't done any sentiment analysis, which I think will be interesting to do.
Okay, thank you. So the time's up. And
thanks a lot.
I think thank you for your great presentation. And okay, let's move on to the next paper. Yuichiro, let's stand for.
Yes. Can you guys see it?
Yep.
All right, great. So, So thank you, Byoung-Ki. So it's a great pleasure to be a part of this session. So what I'm going to present today is a joint paper with Ippei Fujiwara. He's in the audience. So it's titled as a Delphic forward guidance possible in new Keynesian models. So let me just start with the motivation of this paper. The central bank's stance on their communication policy has been changing a lot. So say several decades ago, it was believed that secrecy would make policy more effective. Okay? But things have been changing, and now it's considered important to be transparent in order to manage private sector's expectations. And in addition to this transition from secrecy to transparency, central banks, particularly after the onset of the global financial crisis, started using forward guidance to communicate a likely course of future policy action, as well as their economic outlook in general. So Campbell and others, Campbell, Evans, Fisher, and Justiniano's 2012 paper used the term the Odyssean forward guidance to refer to the forward guidance that involves central bank's commitment. And that's what basically the new Keynesian literature has been analyzing theoretically. And that's what the new Keynesian policy literature has been emphasizing the importance. So it has been emphasized that it's important to conduct such forward guidance in theoretical models. Okay. Campbell and others also coined the term the Delphic forward guidance to refer to communication about the policymakers' potentially superior information about future macroeconomic fundamentals and its own policy goals. And the role of such forward guidance has been, in our view, under-investigated in the new Keynesian literature. And this paper is basically aiming at filling that void. So in this paper, we examine the welfare implication of Delphic forward guidance in new Keynesian models. Okay? So we assume that the central bank has some superior information about future macroeconomic shocks. And we also assume that in addition to the nominal interest rate, the central bank chooses how much information to reveal. Okay. And we basically found what we call the Delphic forward guidance puzzle. The puzzle takes slightly different forms depending on the model we use. Okay. And I will explain that shortly. But in short, it basically means that it's very difficult to improve welfare through Delphic forward guidance in these models. So let me start with the strongest form of the puzzle here. Okay, the strongest form of the puzzle is obtained when we consider a textbook new Keynesian model and introduce superior information on the part of the central bank about the future shocks. In this model, information provision by the central bank unambiguously reduces social welfare. So that's the strongest form of the Delphic forward guidance puzzle. Okay, more information provision, it hurts welfare. Okay, and there are two main reasons behind this strong result. And the first reason is that the Phillips curve is forward-looking. Okay, so it's forward-looking and it's affected by the public's inflation expectations. So because of this, when the public has access to more information about the future shocks, their inflation expectations basically move with anticipated future shocks, okay? Meaning that the inflation expectations basically become more volatile, okay? And that's gonna destabilize the economy, increase the variance of inflation itself, so that's bad, okay? So I will explain this mechanism later in more details. The second reason is that in the simple model, there is no endogenous state variables. Okay? So because of this property, even if the central bank reacts to future shocks today, okay, by adjusting the nominal interest rate today, it does not help stabilize the future economic outcomes. Okay? Because there's no state variable, it's not going to affect anything in the future. Okay? So there's no gain from reacting early. So we move on to the two variants of the new Keynesian models with endogenous state variables. Then the puzzle, the Delphic forward guidance puzzle, becomes a little bit weaker, but still for a wide range of parameter values, full information revelation is not optimal. So either no information revelation is optimal or partial information revelation is optimal. And even when partial information revelation is optimal, we find that interest rate policy can basically convey all the necessary information. In other words, basically the message can be conveyed by the action, the nominal interest rate, okay? And the communication is redundant. So in these models with endogenous state variables, preemptive policy reaction to future shocks potentially help stabilize the future economic variables. So that's a benefit. Okay? But what we found here is that the negative effect of information revelation that operates through the new Keynesian Phillips curve tends to dominate. Okay? And finally, we use a more elaborate DSG model, so Smith-Walters or Christian Eichenbaum-Evans type, a more complicated DSG models with many shocks and many frictions. Okay? And we found that the welfare effect of the Delphic forward guidance depends crucially on the details of the model, and it's actually sensitive to the details. Okay? So even if we focus on a particular shock, the sign of the welfare effect of revealing future realization of the shock is flipped quite easily when some frictions are added to the model or removed from the model. So when we change the specifications, then the welfare sign basically flips quite easily. Okay. So in this model, the central bank has superior information about various shocks, but there's no simple criterion as to which shocks to reveal, okay, in order to improve welfare. So using superior information to improve welfare through communication, that's a difficult task. So in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the key mechanism, the new Keynesian Phillips curve, and then I'm going to talk about some results obtained in the models with endogenous state variables. So here's a slide for the literature review, but of course I'm going to skip it. So let's focus on the textbook new Keynesian model and understand why the new Keynesian Phillips curve is a key mechanism to obtain the Delphic forward guidance puzzle in the strongest form. So who are they in this model? Private agents and the central bank. Okay. Private agents consist of the representative household, and they are monopolistically competitive firms that set nominal prices subject to, say, curve of friction. Okay? In order to focus on the role of forward guidance, we assume that there is no information asymmetry about the contemporaneous shocks, okay? Whereas the central bank possesses some superior information about future shocks. We also assume that private agents are homogeneously informed in order to focus on the information asymmetry between private agents and the central bank. Okay? So here's a timeline within a particular period T. Okay? And it's mostly the same as the standard model, and I'm highlighting in red where we deviate from the textbook model. So at the beginning of the period, a contemporaneous shock hit the economy, and that's observed by everyone. Okay? And here, for simplicity, I'm going to focus on the price markup shock only. Next is unique to this model. The central bank observes private signal about future shocks. Okay? And then central bank chooses the nominal interest rate policy action as well as public message, okay? So that represents communication, okay? And private agents observe both the nominal interest rate and the public message without error and make decisions. So here everyone is in reach and everyone is like expert. They understand everything, okay? The message correctly. And the aggregate outcome realizes the output gap xt and the inflation pi t realize. So here we assume that the central bank commits to a strategy that maps the central bank's information to its action as well as message. Okay? So both the action and the message chosen by the central bank depends on the past history of what central bank has been observing up to that period. Okay? And we consider rational expectation equilibrium as usual, which is a stochastic process of inflation and the output gap that satisfies the new Keynesian Phillips group and the dynamic IS equation or the Euler equation. Okay? So unlike in the standard model, the private agent beliefs are endogenous. Okay? They update their beliefs in the Bayesian fashion after observing the message and the nominal interest rate based on the knowledge about the central bank's strategy. Okay. So we consider the optimal commitment policy problem to figure out what's the best thing to do in this economy. Okay. The central bank is benevolent and minimizes the ex-ante welfare loss subject to the constraint. And ex-ante loss is the unconditional expectation of the discounted sum of period losses, meaning that it is the expected loss before any shock is observed in period zero. Okay? So before the start of the economy. Okay? And there are two constraints. First, the central bank's periodic actions depend only on the information that is available to the central bank up to that period. Second, the output gap and the inflation must constitute a rational expectation equilibrium given the central bank's strategy. So what is the solution? Well, as I said in the introduction, a solution to this problem features secrecy. Okay? So it is actually suboptimal to send a message that reveals superior information possessed by the central bank. And it is also suboptimal to set the nominal interest rate using superior information. Okay? The formal proof is in the paper, and in the following, I will try to explain the reason intuitively. So first, I'm going to consider a special case of this model, and that's a limiting case in which the welfare loss diverges to infinity if the output gap is non-zero. So that's a limit. So we are taking the limit of lambda, which is a coefficient of the output gap squared in the loss function. Okay? And we are taking the limit of it to infinity. So in the limit, it is optimal to stabilize the output gap completely at zero. Otherwise, the loss becomes infinite. Okay? So if the output gap is always zero, no matter what, okay, then it's easy to solve for inflation, okay, by solving the new Keynesian Phillips curve forward. The period T inflation is just a conditional expectation of discounted sum of future markup shocks. Okay? So let's suppose, for simplicity, that the markup shocks are IID with mean zero and finite variance. Then what happens if the n period ahead shocks are observed without error? Okay? So imagine that this is conveyed by the central bank to the public. So what if the private sector get this information? So as a benchmark, let's consider the case where no future shock is observed, which means n is zero. Okay? In this case, everything is super simple. Inflation is equal to the current shock. Conditional expectation of one period ahead inflation is zero because shocks are mean zero IID. Ex-ante expectation of inflation squared that appears in the loss function is the shock variance. Okay? This is very simple. So what would happen if n is, say, bigger than or equal to 1? Okay? When future shocks are observed, things change as follows. So first, period t inflation equals the discounted sum of shocks from period t to t plus n. Okay? And the period t conditional expectation also depends on the future anticipated shocks. Okay? And importantly, ex-ante expectation of inflation squared that appears in the loss function is now linear in the shock variance, but the coefficient is now bigger than 1. Okay? The coefficient is bigger than 1 and it increases with n. Okay? So remember that the higher n means more information is provided to the private sector. Okay? So higher n means more information revelation, and it makes both inflation expectations and inflation itself more volatile in this simple example. Okay. So in this special case, we can see immediately that providing more information about the future shock is bad. Okay, it makes inflation more volatile. So what about the more general case? So let's look at the graphical explanation here. Okay. So imagine that, so forget about the IID assumption or lambda equals infinity assumption. Okay. Forget about this. Okay. Now let's look at the New-Keynesian Phillips curve directly. Okay. Suppose that the private agent's information set in period t is just expanded, okay, from IT to IT new. The first equation in the New-Keynesian Phillips curve on this slide is given the expanded information set. Okay? And we can rewrite the right-hand side by adding and subtracting the same term, which is the discounted expected inflation given the original information set. So these two terms are the same, adding and subtracting, so they cancel with each other. So this is the same expression. So what is important here is that the red terms here are the original terms that existed even before the information set is expanded. And the blue terms here are the updating terms that represent how much inflation expectations are updated by additional information that was not contained in the original information set. Importantly, these two terms are orthogonal to each other. Okay? And that's because the red terms are contained in the original information set, whereas blue terms are not. They are based on the newly added information. Okay? So they are orthogonal to each other. So holding fixed the distribution of next period inflation, the blue terms basically acts as an additional shock term in the New-Keynesian Phillips curve. So if you assume, say, normal distribution, then these two terms are orthogonal, so they are independent. So adding blue terms is equivalent to adding an independent shock to the New-Keynesian Phillips curve, and that's bad. So here's a graphical representation. So without the additional information, the New-Keynesian Phillips curve looks like the left one. Okay? And with additional information, the New-Keynesian Phillips curve may shift upward or downward. Okay? But because the updating term is not predictable given the original information set, in the right figure, the position of the Phillips curve is on average unchanged. So it may shift up and it may shift down with some probabilities, but on average, they stay in the same position. Okay? So what happens here is that given the convexity of the loss function, Jensen's inequality implies that the situation illustrated on the left is preferred to the situation on the right. Okay? So here, the additional information basically worsens the average trade-off faced by the central bank. It just shifts the New-Keynesian Phillips curve, okay, upward and downward randomly. And that's not going to be a good thing. Okay? So therefore, in this textbook New-Keynesian model, we have the Delphic for the guidance puzzle in the strongest form. In models with endogenous state variables, preemptive reactions to anticipated future shocks have some benefit. Okay? And this is because by adjusting endogenous state variables now, central bank may be able to absorb part of the anticipated future shocks upon its realization. Okay? So we examined two models. The first model features the backward price indexation, the natural rate shock, and the effective lower bound on the nominal interest rate. Okay? So in this model, if inflation is raised today, then through backward price indexation, it's going to raise future inflation and the future expected inflation. Okay, so if a negative natural rate shock hit the economy in the future, and that's going to make the zero lower bound binding, okay, higher inflation today is going to help relax the future zero lower bound constraint. So that's the benefit of acting early. In the second model, we have price and wage thickness and two markup shock that hit two Phillips curves. Okay, and here the real wage is a state variable, and the central bank can influence this real wage through the current monetary policy action. So what is the optimal policy in two models? So for simplicity, we assumed that the shocks hit the economy only once in period 1. Okay? And we characterize the optimal message and interest rate setting policy in period 0. Okay? In the first model, with realistic parameter values, it's optimal to reveal no information. Okay? Central bank acts early by setting a low nominal interest rate in period 0, but it does so independently of its anticipated shock in order not to reveal superior information. In the second model, it's optimal to reveal no information when both thicknesses are sufficiently strong.
Sorry to interrupt this, but you have spent 20 minutes ahead, so please conclude in a few minutes. Okay, thank you.
So when one of the thickness is sufficiently weak, partial information revelation is optimal. By partial, I mean conveying a linear combination of two shocks. So secrecy is still optimal in these two models for a wide range of parameterization of these models. So it's basically difficult to overturn the negative effect that's brought about by the forward-looking new Keynesian Phillips curve, even in these two models with endogenous state variables. So let me just conclude. So we have shown many things in this paper, but the bottom line is on the bottom line of this slide, which is overall our results cast doubt on the usefulness of the Delphic forward guidance in these new Keynesian models. So thank you very much. That's it for my presentation.
Okay, thank you. Sorry for the interruption. And is there any questions, comments from the speakers?
Yes, I just have one small question. So I would be I don't know if you tried this, but you know the model of Gabex tried to put some behaviors and some non-rationality in the model. And I do think that, so I have a paper who is also dealing with the impact of myopia on optimal monetary policy. And I'm wondering if adding more realistic behaviors on the household side may change your results. I don't know if you have checked that, but I just would like to hear from you if you think yes or no and why. Thank you very much.
So my guess is that the answer is no. In particular, so the Gabai's paper, so you can interpret it as a mechanism that may solve the standard forward guidance puzzle, right? So it basically reduces the effect of future shocks on the current outcome. Okay, but that's about the size, okay, of the response of current economic variables to the future anticipated shocks. Okay, but here what we are talking about is the sign. Okay, so the usual forward guidance puzzle is about the size of the response. Okay, but here we are talking about the sign of the welfare effect. Okay, so central bank has superior information. So by using it, shouldn't it be able to improve welfare? We find in many cases the answer is no. Okay, so we think that the size of the welfare effect will get smaller if we include or embed that kind of behavioral bias. Okay, but I'm not expecting that the sign will flip.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm not that agree, but I do think it should not completely vanish your result. Of course, this is not the objective of the question, but it would temper the results. So, but it's a worth try to do that in such a framework, because staying in a rational expectation framework, I mean, of course, provides a less realistic way about how, as a central banker, we are interpreting the usefulness of the forward guidance. So that is why I asked this question. Thank you very much.
So I see some Q&A from the screen, but I have a quick question. And actually, I see that the full credibility of the central bank is not always beneficial, according to your paper. So is there any room for the central bank to exploit this, in the sense that the lowering the credibility by providing some manipulated information to the public?
Lowering the credibility by manipulating.
Yeah. So either yeah. So in the sense that either just smoothing out the future, the expectations on the future inflation. So maybe it'll increase the welfare according to the definition of the.
So right. So here we are assuming that the central bank can basically commit to a particular communication policy. So basically, it can fix the conditional distribution of messages given the history of the signals. When the central bank is unable to commit, then we should be thinking about its strategic motives, and it's gonna be hard. So I don't know the answer. So, but say a paper by Marco Bassettos, recently published in JME, he considered that, say, a cheap talk game, repeated one. So maybe that framework may be applicable in that situation. So, but I don't know the answers. So. Yeah.
So I guess that there is a question from the Q&A window. Can you see? It's from Julian Polania. And in reality, there is a lot of uncertainty, not only about the shocks, but also on central bank preferences. So its view on the economy, revealing the expected path of the policy rate has an impact on credibility. So it's like in line of my question. So how to include such benefits in theoretical model in a simple way? I guess that this is kind of similar to my question after reading this. So maybe I guess the time's almost up. So you can type in the answers to this question after the.
No problem.
So okay, thank you for your. Yeah, thank you for your excellent presentation. Okay, so now I guess we have to move on to the next paper file. Are you ready? So the screen is yours.
Thanks so much, Byoung. Can you see my presentation? Good. I'm gonna assume you can.
Yeah, so I can see it. I can see it. Sorry. Yeah.
Perfect. This is a joint work with Stein Classes and Ricardo Correa. And I also have to tell you the usual disclaimer, because I work for the Federal Reserve Board, that these are my views and not those of the Fed or the BIS. So let me summarize in just one slide what we do in the paper. So, I mean, if you were to get a message from the paper, it would be whatever is in this slide. So we're going to investigate how differences in central banks' financial stability governance frameworks explain their communication strategies, how they use other policy instruments, including macroprudential tools, and whether these strategies are effective on alleviating the deterioration of financial cycle conditions. So in the paper, we propose a conceptual framework to understand the interaction between governance frameworks and communication strategies, and we get a few simple hypotheses and empirically test them in the rest of the paper. And what we find empirically is that governance frameworks shape financial stability communication strategies and how effective they are alleviating the deterioration of these financial cycle conditions. And also that financial stability communication is a powerful tool for central banks, but the central banks that have more robust financial stability governance frameworks are much more successful at using communication tools. So I'm going to go really quickly through the literature, but basically what we're going to do is bridge a gap between two branches of the literature, one on governance frameworks and the other one on financial stability communication. Several relatively new papers have renewed the interest in financial stability governance framework, including some people from the Fed, and they have databases on central banks governance frameworks. Whenever we talk about central bank communication, I think most of the papers that we find in the literature are about monetary policy. And whenever central bank communication about monetary policy talks about how central banks can have different communication strategies, they tend to center the attention on the role of transparency. There is a literature on financial stability communication, but it's still at very early stages. Financial stability reports, to begin with, are relatively new for most central banks in the world. And there are a few papers that assume that explore communication strategies, but they in general assume that central banks are homogeneous. And what we're going to do here is precisely exploit this idea that they will behave differently. So this is the presentation. I'm going to tell you a bit more about the conceptual framework, introduce the databases that we use, and tell you about the evidence. And then I'm going to conclude if I have time. So the conceptual framework can be summarized in this cartoon. There is a central banker that is going to use communication as a policy tool to sort of protect the central banks in the country and prevent a financial crisis. So the banks in the country, the financial institutions, are going to be the sheep, and a crisis would be this wolf. So a communication strategy will refer to how close the wolf was when the message was sent out and whether the message is credible. So this is when the central banker cry wolves. And communication is going to be effective if you cry wolf, but the wolf doesn't come, or the wolf is gone, or doesn't cause any damage to the financial institutions. In the paper, of course, we don't have the cartoon, but we have a more sort of schematic version of this framework with 3 periods. In the first period, the central bank is going to observe initial financial condition. So it's going to receive both public information and private information, and it's going to form expectations about the current conditions and expectations about the future conditions. In the second period, which we label T+L, the central bank is basically going to use all of its tools. The tool that we're going to center the attention on is going to be communication. So the communication strategy is going to be that the central bank is going to write, for the purpose of financial stability, a financial stability report in which it's going to communicate what it feels about the current conditions and what it feels about the future, the evolution of the conditions. So and in this period, the central bank is going to also be able to use other policy tools, such as monetary policy and macroprudential tools. So how do we sort of structure the communication strategies? Where communication strategies could be when whatever the central bank writes about the current conditions is different from whatever it observed. So this is what we call FSS, which is the sentiment in financial stability reports, can be different from FS, which are the conditions that the central bank observed. So basically, the central bank is going to have some flexibility in whatever private information it receives. The central bank can also communicate different expectations about the evolution of the financial cycle compared to what it actually thinks. And one of the ideas that we had in mind is that the central bank might, for example, decide to send a message of calm because it's going to prevent, for example, that the agents panic, and it's going to make the financial crisis even more, the probability is even higher. And then in the third period, what's going to happen is that financial conditions are going to evolve, and the evolution of these conditions is going to depend on the initial conditions, whatever actions the central bank took, and of course, shocks. So there are things we cannot control, such as COVID. And for simplicity, there are only 2 possible scenarios. Financial conditions are going to be better, or financial conditions are going to be worse. And the worst component is the one that we're going to call a crisis. So this crisis happens with probability 1 minus pi, and we're going to simplify tremendously the effectiveness of communication by deciding that the central bank wants to minimize this probability of a crisis. So we're going to test 2 very simple hypotheses from this simple conceptual framework. Communication is going to be effective if the financial conditions in T plus H are going to be alleviated by this interaction between communication and governance frameworks. And communication strategies is going to be whatever we write in these financial stability reports, how it relates to the current conditions and these governance characteristics, right? Whether the central bank is going to be revealing private information or it's going to be transmitting a message of calm in the future. So these are two very simple hypotheses that I'm going to test in the remainder of the paper. To do so, I'm going to merge three databases, one that has to do with governance characteristics, the other one has to do with a financial stability report, so the communication part, and the third one has to do with financial stability conditions. So let's take a look at governance characteristics. These are other projects that, including some folks from the board, are collecting. And we're going to center the attention on the governance framework that has to do with financial stability, in particular on three characteristics: whether the central bank of this country participates in a financial stability committee, whether that committee has the powers to implement other tools, including macroprudential tools, and whether that central bank has an oversight role or not. As you can see, there is a lot. This is a snapshot for 2017, but we are going to find indeed a lot of heterogeneity across countries, which is precisely where we're going to explode, that some countries have one characteristic, the other, or a combination of the characteristics. In terms of financial stability communications, we're going to use the text in financial stability reports. We're going to center the attention on central banks that write or translate reports to English. And at the end, we end up with a sample of 24 countries. And the sentiment index that we use is a sentiment index that is by now very standard in the literature, and we used it in a previous paper with Ricardo Correa and some of our research assistants. The index is calculated as the proportion of negative to positive words. And the way we know whether a word is positive or negative is using the dictionary that we constructed for our review of finance paper. Just to give you an idea of the dynamics of this sentiment index, I'm going to plot a figure of our sample, which goes from 2005 to the end of 2019. Since the index is the proportion of negative to positive words, one would expect that the index would increase whenever there is a deterioration in sentiment. And indeed, the dynamics seem to be the ones we were expecting. That is, sentiment deteriorates a lot around crises, especially around the Lehman crisis, the second Greek bailout. And we do have data for COVID, but we don't use it for this paper, and sentiment deteriorates tremendously during COVID. So the index is doing precisely what we were expecting. There are some differences if you sort of plot the banks that participate in a committee and those that do not. It's hard to see here because we're aggregating across all central banks, but the central banks might react a little bit sooner or later, or they might react with more sentiment deterioration than others. This is precisely what we're going to explore. The third database, as I told you, is the one that has to do with financial stability conditions. And we're going to use two types of variables. One are slow-moving credit variables. And these are the ones we're going to use to test for the effectiveness of communication. These are credit to GDP gap, the debt service ratio, and the total credit to the private non-financial sector. But we're also going to use some high-frequency financial cycle characteristics, especially for the part that we sort of analyze communication strategies. So we use several asset valuation ratios and several measures of systemic risk. And we're going to use a particular definition of financial stability events because we're going to focus the attention on communication around turning points. So throughout the paper, we define turning points in credit to GDP gap as local maximums followed by one-year drops in the gap. And the idea for this is basically to increase the number of financial stability events and not only focus on these two events, the global financial crisis and the euro area crisis, which are sort of the two main crises in our country. So what we call financial stability events are not necessarily financial stability crises. So let's test the first hypothesis, which is whether a financial stability communication interacts with a financial stability governance frameworks to make this communication more effective. And we use a sample of 24 countries between 2005 and 2009. We have quarterly data, and our framework relates a lot to this hypothesis testing that I was telling you from the model. So the left-hand side variable is going to be the evolution of the financial cycle in the future. In this case, I'm only going to show you the results for credit to GDP gap 1 year ahead. And then what we have on the right-hand side is precisely communication, the current communication, and I'm going to have it interact with a dummy variable that takes a value of 1 if the central bank has one particular governance characteristic. So basically, the simple thing about this setting is that the sole driver of the heterogeneous communication effects is going to be this dummy for one of the characteristics. We test the characteristics individually because we don't have enough data to do it jointly. And when we did it jointly, things were just not working. Also, the characteristics are more correlated, are highly correlated. So if you look at the table, I think we should center the attention on this row that has the interaction between dummy and FSS, which is the beta 2. And what we find here is a negative coefficient, and that it's significant. And the way we should interpret this coefficient is a relative effect. So for example, for credit to GDP, what we find, and the main takeaway from this table should be that credit to GDP is relatively small, so smaller when negative sentiment increases in countries that have a committee with power, or oversight role. And we do the same results for the debt service ratio and the credit to GDP, and the credit growth, and we find consistent results. So one natural question at this point would be, well, the reason you're getting the committee to have like a significant role is because that's the only variable that you're considering, right? So we run a set of robustness tests. I think the most interesting one would be to see if there are other characteristics that could explain this heterogeneous effect of communication. So we have the same regression setting. Credit to GDP gap is our left-hand side variable. There's an interaction between communication and a dummy for governance characteristic, but we're also going to allow it for an interaction between communication and any other characteristic. The characteristics would be transparency, financial openness, foreign bank ownership, bank international claim, which is the BIS database, and whether these reports are written by central banks that have English as one of their official languages. So the results are pretty interesting in that the effect of the interaction between the governance characteristic and communication is still negative and significant, so this relatively more effective effect. But the interaction between these characteristics and communication is just not significant. So I think the main takeaway from this table is that the relevance of having a financial stability committee is independent of having one of these characteristics. So now one thing that we know is that when we look at all periods, normal periods and crisis period, we get a sort of an effect of effectiveness of communication from having a committee or an oversight role. So what we're going to do here is center the attention on these financial stability events. So we switch the setting. So it's still the setting for effectiveness, but in this case, it's going to be a private setting in which the left-hand side variable is a dummy that takes a value of 1 when there's a financial stability event. And the right-hand side is just the sentiment in financial stability reports. And in this case, we're not going to have them interact, but we're going to split the sample in whether the central banks participate in a committee or not, participate in a committee with powers or not, and have an oversight role or not. And I think the main result of this table, which was a little bit puzzling at first, is that if you look at the columns that have a no, so not participating in a committee or not having an oversight role, you always get a positive and significant coefficient. And the way we can explain this is that central banks without the characteristics, they're going to cry wolf, and the probability of a crisis is actually going to be higher. So the wolf is actually going to come. I have a typo there, it's wolf. But for the central banks that do have one of these characteristics, you either get results that are not significant or negative and significant, such as the case of a committee with powers. So for example, for the case of a committee with powers, the main takeaway would be that central banks in committee with powers cry wolf, and they actually manage to avoid its arrival, so reduce the probability of a crisis. I do have to acknowledge here that we might have a potential identification problem, and the problem is the way we construct sort of our dummy for financial stability events, and it's that central banks that are very successful or just very lucky are going to be able to prevent all crises. So for these central banks, you're not going to observe financial stability events. This is, for example, the case of Germany in our sample. It's the only country that has 0 financial stability events. So let's talk about why some central banks are more effective than others at alleviating the deterioration of financial stability conditions. So the objective of this part is to test the second hypothesis and to assess whether communication strategies conditional on governance differ across the financial cycle. And we're also going to explore this coherence in communication as to whether central banks, whenever they communicate that the crisis is about to come, they actually end up taking action and implementing more macroprudential tools or changing the policy rate. So the setting here is also going to follow the hypothesis that we had. And in this case, the left-hand side variable is the sentiment in the financial stability report, and the right-hand side variable is going to be a variable that reflects sentiment in all other sources. I'm only going to show you the results for this sentiment index that we calculate using news related to financial stability for each country. We have in the paper other variables, including the asset valuation ratios and the systemic risk. So the way you could sort of analyze this setting is by saying how do central banks sort of incorporate information and whether they deviate from the information they observe or not. So we're again going to center the attention in the interaction between the dummy and this sentiment in news. And what we find here is again a negative coefficient. So beta 1 is positive and significant. Beta 2 is negative and significant for central banks with a committee or a committee with powers. How do we interpret beta 1 is that indeed the sentiment in news is highly correlated with the sentiment in financial stability reports, and this is irrespective of whether you have a committee or not. However, if the central bank participates in a committee or in a committee with power, the coefficient is negative and significant, meaning that these central banks tend to send a message that is relative calm. So with respect to central banks that do not participate in a committee, these central banks strategically deviate from the sentiment reflected in news by sending a message of calm. So I think one obvious question here is, why do they send a message of calm? And we have several hypotheses in the paper, but I think I'm going to show you the most interesting hypothesis, which is that we think that the central banks are going to send a message that is calmer with respect to the other central banks because they believe that they have the tools to prevent the crisis. And therefore, whenever they communicate their assessment about the evolution of future conditions, they're going to take into account that they have the ability to implement tools and prevent the crisis. So they're going to send a message that say, things are not as bad as we think, but because we can implement these tools. So what we're going to do here is sort of a test of coherence. So the left-hand side variable is how many macroprudential tools the central banks are implementing a year from now. And the right-hand side variable is going to be, again, the interaction between the dummy and the sentiment that central banks have in their financial stability report. I'm going to add here another dummy that takes a value of 1 whenever there is a turning point in the financial stability cycle. And the reason we do this is just to check if the communication is much more coherent when we're approaching a financial stability event. And what we find here is pretty much the same results, that central banks are coherent in the sense that whenever sentiment deteriorates and they have the ability to implement these tools, so the column with committee with powers, they do tend to implement more macroprudential tools. And that explains what beta 2, for example, is positive and significant. We do observe that these central banks tend to implement less tools whenever they're approaching a financial stability event, and this might take into account other considerations, that by the time you're very close to a crisis, you should not implement more macroprudential tools that can actually accelerate the crisis. So in general, we find that communication is effective, that the reason why communication is effective is because central banks tend to send a message of calm, and the reason they send a message of calm is because they're sort of coherent in applying other macroprudential tools. So what we do here is a stronger test in which we say, okay, let's see if communication by itself is still a powerful tool. And the way we do this is by having the probit setting in which the left-hand side variable is the dummy that takes a value of 1 if there is a financial stability event, and the right-hand side is the sentiment in financial stability reports, but we're going to control for the other tools that the central bank implement. So one thing that could happen here is that sentiment in financial stability reports is not significant anymore because you've implemented the other tools. But what we find, if you look at the column of committee with powers and for the row of FSS, is that still central banks that participate in a committee with powers have the ability to sort of reduce the probability of a financial stability event. This is the negative and significant coefficient in that column for the row FSS. So I think the main takeaway from this is that communication is a powerful policy tool for central bank committees, even after implementing other tools, including monetary policy rates and macroprudential policies. And I have only one slide because I'm running out of time. So I'm going to conclude by saying that we find in this paper that communication by central banks participating in interagency financial stability committees are relatively more effective at alleviating the deterioration of financial conditions and at preventing financial stability events. The reason is that the central banks send a message that is calmer with respect to central banks that do not participate in committees. And a calmer message could be explained by the ability to implement macroprudential tools. So I'm looking forward to hear your comments. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. Is there any questions or comments? First among the speakers. I don't see. Oh,
sorry.
Juan,
Juan, I'm now afraid I made this comment before, so apologize. Do apologize if I did, but I'm wondering a little bit about endogeneity of these governance structures and variations over time. Is there a trend over time, and does this correlate with the use of macroprudential tools? I mean, macroprudential tools are used much more frequently, at least in Europe, more recently than they were before. There might also be time variation in risk aversion. There might be time variation in the type of governance structure that we see more and more frequently. So is there any, are we picking up time variation here? Have you controlled for that, or did you look into time variation? And again, apologies if I asked that before.
No, I actually don't remember, Michael, if you did, but there is, yes. Many central banks in our sample do change their governance frameworks after the global financial crisis. There is still a lot of heterogeneity, so that allows us to identify in our setting. There is some time variation, so there are two ways in which we can correct for that, given the data that we have. One is that we start the sample in 2005, and therefore we remove a lot of countries. So we initially had a sample that was much bigger, probably 40 central banks, but we only had that sample study in 2008. So there was this issue that there was a self-selection bias because they started writing reports in English precisely when they changed the governance framework. So we sort of have a control sample for a few years before the crisis. The other thing we do in the setting is that the dummy for whether the central bank has one of the governance characteristics or not is lagged, sort of to prevent for this endogenous effect. But in general, when central banks change their governance frameworks, they do it for good. So they go from not having a committee to having a committee the rest of the sample. So we don't observe time variation in jumping from one state to the other. So I think you're completely right. There is endogeneity. There are two ways in which we can correct that, which are the ones that I said, but I don't know if you have ideas to do other sort of corrections.
Well, I mean, maybe just including a time fixed effect in some of these models and seeing how much you still get. It would be worthwhile. I mean, that's easy to do.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Any questions? Jonathan, do you have? Okay, I don't see any questions through the Q&A windows. So I'll just throw a quick question. What if central bank is kind of afraid of restricting the monetary policy effectiveness by giving some messages on the financial stability? So have you ever considered these facts?
Sorry, Bjorn, can you repeat that again?
So what if the central bank is, a little bit afraid when it is giving some messages regarding the financial stability? So the message regarding the financial stability, possibly restrict the, room for the monetary policy of the central bank. So maybe so if central bank gives some message regarding financial stability, it should be, it cannot be strong, I guess.
So see, I think that's precisely a communication strategy, what you're saying. So let's think for a second of a central bank that has a let's call it less robust financial governance framework. For example, it doesn't do any oversight on the financial institutions, it doesn't have a committee, and it doesn't have the ability to implement these tools because there is another agency in that country that is in charge of these tools. And this happens in many countries in our sample. So I think actually the incentive for this central bank, because it's going to be held accountable, is to cry wolf louder, because it has to warn these other agencies that they have to act. It's going to say, the wolf is coming, I don't have the tools, you have to stop the wolf. Now, if the central bank has the tools, I think you're right. And the communication strategy should be precisely to send a message of calm, saying, everything is fine, even when you're hearing from the news that things are not great, everything is fine. And the reason everything is fine is not just because we're saying it, but because we have the tools to sort of prevent the arrival of the wolf. So I think that's where communication strategies sort of are different between the central banks. Now, I don't think if we can entirely test this hypothesis that central banks are sort of afraid to reveal information, because we don't know, for example, how much private information they receive. One would expect that central banks that have an oversight role receive more private information because they can see sort of data for the health of the financial system. But other than that, we don't know if they're revealing private information or not. So that's still an open question. Oh, Byoung, you're muted.
Sorry, Jonathan, do you have any questions? No,
I mean, I'm using extensively his first financial stability sentiment. So I'm very glad to present here with Juan here. I really enjoy your paper. I will have maybe other questions in the future, but I really enjoyed the findings also, and it's really related to what we have in central banks. So thank you very much for this very nice and papers and presentation. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks so much, Jonathan. I appreciate that, and thanks everyone for your comments.
I don't see any further questions through the Q&A window, so I think we have to stop here. And thank you very much for the participants, especially the speakers, for excellent presentations. And so see you around in the other sessions of this conference. Okay, thank you very much. Bye.
Bye,
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.